Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you are well. We are competing with the Wimbledon's singles final, but that'll be continuing for long after our talk. I think matches normally continue for about 3 hours. But yeah, it's great to be with you again after my talk last year. And in this talk, as Tim said, I'm going to be partially discussing my new book, which is called Disconnected. But also I'm going to be sort of looking ahead to my next book, which is published in January next year, which is called The Adventure, A Practical Guide to Spiritual Awakening. I'm going to be taking you through a couple of exercises from my next book. But what I was trying to suggest in my new book, Disconnected, is that our culture is based on the premise that human beings are essentially disconnected. We are essentially separate entities who live inside our own mental space in isolation and separation from each other. And that's all of the assumptions in our culture, all of the assumptions which form the worldview of our culture are based on that premise. But every spiritual tradition suggests instead that human beings are actually interconnected. Every spiritual tradition, every spiritual path tries to take us beyond the illusion of separateness. In every spiritual tradition, whether it's the Kabbalah, Sufism, Christian mysticism, Judaic mysticism, or Buddhism, there is a path which leads away from separation towards a state of union. And there are lots of gradations along that path. And eventually, we transcend separateness gradually. We move towards greater degrees of connection. And eventually, at the end of the path, or maybe it's not true to say that there is a specific end to any spiritual path, but certainly in the higher or furthest regions of that path, we move into a state of union. What do we become united with? Well, some traditions would suggest that it's some divine force, some divine entity. Other traditions would suggest that it's some essential or fundamental spiritual force. In the Hindu tradition, that's called Brahman, the essential spiritual energy or force which pervades the universe. And obviously in mystical traditions which are associated with monotheistic religions, there may be a more personal vision of that all-pervading spiritual force. But essentially, it's the same direction. All spiritual traditions move in the same direction towards union with some fundamental spiritual force. And significantly, it's not just a spiritual force which is out there in the world, which pervades the world. It's also within our own being. And not just our own beings, it's within the being of all living things, all human beings, all living things, even seemingly inanimate objects. They're all pervaded with this essential spiritual force. So when we become connected or united with a spiritual force, we also become connected or united with all living things and all phenomenal things, even crop circles. I guess you could say that. That's from Lady C. Yeah, even crop circles, all inanimate, so-called inanimate, and all living objects and beings. So that's what I'm going to discuss in this talk. I'm going to guide you through a couple of meditations or exercises to hopefully give you an experiential glimpse of this fundamental spiritual force or energy. I have a kind of personal philosophy which I call pan-spiritism, and you've maybe heard of the philosophy of panpsychism, which suggests that panpsychism suggests that all things have an element of, well, all atoms, all material particles have a tiny element of consciousness in them. So consciousness is a property of matter in atoms and other particles. But what I call panspiritism is a slightly different variant of that. I suggest in panspiritism that consciousness is not just in matter, it's in everything. It's in the air around us, it's in the universe itself, it's in all space. All the space that pervades the universe is also full of consciousness, or spirit, you could say. So my perspective is based on the philosophy that I call pan-spiritism. But just let me begin with a short, if it's okay with you, maybe we could have a short meditation to begin to still our minds and to ease into a state of calmness. And actually I'm just going to be away for 1 second. There's a bang. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a bang. It's very windy here in Manchester. So there's a banging door in my son's room next door. I'm just going to pop next door for a moment and close the banging door. And there's that lady again. Let me read you this short poem, which is called Slow Down, and then I'll guide you through a short meditation. This is a poem about the importance of presence, that in order to be present in our lives, we have to slow down. And the theme of this session is connection, and presence and connection are closely interlinked, because you have to be present to be fully connected to somebody or to the activity that you're engaged in. So this is a short poem called Slow Down. Slow down. The world keeps speeding up, moving much too fast. That's why it's full of chaos. That's why it's heading for catastrophe. Slow down. Don't be so desperate to reach the future that you push the present away. Treat each moment with respect, as a friend who deserves your attention. Greet every new experience as a guest who's welcome to be part of your life. Slow down and feel how the stress of doing turns into ease of being. Slow down and feel how your rigid separateness softens into spacious belonging. Slow down and see how the future fades like a mirage, and how the present arises around you, as clear and fresh as dawn. Let's close our eyes for a moment, and let's slow down. Bring your attention to your breathing for a moment. Be aware of the rhythm of your breathing. Feel the sensation of the air brushing your nose as you breathe in and out. Sense how your breathing slows down with your attention as you become more relaxed. As your breathing becomes slower, deeper, and longer. Slowing down a little with each breath. As your breathing slows down with each breath, Be aware how a feeling of relaxation begins to fill you. Now bring your attention away from your breath towards the area of your heart. Listen to and feel the rhythm of your heart beating through your body. And again, as you're aware of your heart beating, sense that it slows down a little with your attention. As it slows down, again, a feeling of relaxation grows within your body. Be aware of your breathing and your heartbeat together, both of those rhythms, and sense how they both are slowing down at the same time. Now let's bring our attention away from our body into the mind. Bring your attention into your mental space. Perhaps you're aware of some thoughts or associations passing through your mental space. As with your heartbeat and your breathing, sense how those thoughts or associations begin to slow down with your attention, just like a stream or a river which is slowly becoming still. Allow your stream of thoughts to slow down and settle. Again, with a sense of calmness or relaxation filling you. Allow your attention now to fall beneath the stream of thoughts at the surface of your mind into your deep being beneath the surface of your mind. Allow your attention to fall down as if you're diving into your deep being. And you can feel the source of the deep relaxation that you feel, the deep calmness. You feel yourself falling and becoming one with the source of that calmness and relaxation in your deep being. Way down, deep into the essence of your being. And now let's retain that sense of connection with our own deep being, that feeling of relaxation. Let's bring our attention back to the rooms that you're sitting in. Bring your attention back to the sounds inside the room, the feeling of your body against the chair or the floor. Let's bring this exercise to a close and open our eyes again. I often think that it's a shame that we can't live more slowly. You know, our societies encourage us to live quickly and to move hurriedly through our days. But when we rush, we miss so much, and we also miss the natural harmony and even the natural contentment of our deep being, because we become so focused on achievement and so focused on achieving our future goals. You could also think of this in terms of connection. I often think that, as I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, that spiritual awakening or spiritual development is about increasing connection. It's about connecting with our own deep being, as we did in that meditation. It's also about connecting to other people. It's about connecting to other people's beings, sharing their consciousness, extending our own consciousness into other people so we can sense their emotions and their joys and their sufferings. It's also about connecting to nature, connecting to the harmony and stillness of nature. So spiritual development is about connection in many different areas. I'll just briefly share a slide with you. This is from my new book. This is what I call the continuum, the continuum of connection. And my book, Disconnected, is based on this model. So one of the things I was trying to understand in my book was why human beings cover such a wide spectrum of behavior. Human beings can be incredibly brutal and cruel, but we can also be incredibly selfless, incredibly generous, compassionate, and altruistic. I explain this in terms of this model, that cruelty and brutality stem from disconnection, and the most disconnected people are the most brutal and cruel. So when people are sometimes diagnosed with psychopathy or narcissistic personality disorder, that's because they exist in a state of extreme disconnection, a state of general disconnection towards the world, towards other people, and also towards themselves. They may experience a kind of connection on a kind of very superficial, limited level, but essentially they are disconnected from the world. They live in a state of extreme separation. And that means that they lack the capacity for empathy. They can't sense other people's emotions or sufferings, and that makes it possible for them to abuse, to manipulate, to exploit other people, because other people are essentially objects to them. So on an extreme level, that's where psychopathic behavior arises. Even criminality, violent criminality, arises from there. In politics, where the most ruthless dictators and fascists are based. They emerge from this state of extreme disconnection. But on the other side, we have a state of intense connection, which is where spirituality arises. So spirituality is all about connecting in the ways I described earlier. And that's why spiritual people, or spiritually developed people, they always have high levels of empathy. They have a very pronounced capacity to feel the emotions and experiences of other people. And that gives rise to altruism, because if you sense other people's sufferings, you have an immediate impulse to try to alleviate their sufferings. And that's why spiritually developed people, they're not really so concerned with their own personal egoic concerns. Well, to a degree, of course, but they're also equally or even more concerned for the well-being of others, for the well-being of the entire planet or our entire species. And they often feel a connection to universal moral principles of justice and equality and fairness. So whereas extremely disconnected people, they have no morality. All that matters to them is the fulfillment of their own desires and ambitions. For intensely connected or spiritual people, what matters to them is the well-being of others, and also the also the enactment of universal moral principles of justice and equality. Somebody like Gandhi is a good example of a spiritually developed person who lived for universal moral principles. Whereas, psychopathic dictators like Hitler or Stalin or President Putin, they are extremely disconnected people who care nothing apart from for their own ambitions and desires, which by extension become the ambitions and desires of their own government or countries. So that's the way I explain the spectrum of human behavior. I think most human beings are probably somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. Fortunately, there are not many psychopathic people around. Psychologists usually say that about 1% of the population have psychopathic traits. But unfortunately, there are not many spiritually awakened people around. Maybe it's something similar, maybe 1% or less. So most of us are somewhere in the middle. But my suggestion in my book is that our lives should be, the goal of our lives should be to move further along this spectrum or this continuum, to move further towards connection. And that's the aim of all personal, moral, or spiritual development. It's to move further along the continuum of connection, away from separateness, towards greater compassion and empathy, and so forth. So I think, if you follow any spiritual path or any path of personal development, that's the direction you're heading in. That's the direction we're all heading in, ultimately. I think ultimately, all humans are moving along this continuum. All societies as well. I think there's probably a historical evolutionary movement along this continuum of connection, away from brutality towards empathy and compassion. So I'd like you to consider for a moment. Let me just see if I can stop showing my slides. I'd like you to consider for a moment, there's a concept I sometimes refer to, which I call the circle of concern. And it relates to the continuum of connection. I'd like you to consider for a moment how wide your circle of concern stretches. So maybe as I speak, you can contemplate your own life and your own perspective on reality. How wide does your circle of concern stretch? At the narrowest point, a person's circle of concern is focused entirely on their own needs and desires without caring too much about other people's welfare. Or perhaps for some people, the circle of concern extends to their family, maybe their close friends. So maybe they will be empathic and altruistic within that small context. Or maybe for some people, maybe for you, your circle of concern stretches wider towards your community, your immediate community, maybe your religious or ethnic group. so that you feel empathy towards people who share your beliefs and your background. Or more widely still, maybe for some people, it extends to their nation, so that their compatriots are the focus of their empathy and altruism. But maybe your circle of concern extends beyond that towards the entire human species, the entire human race, irrespective of any nations or any communities. Maybe you have a global perspective that you extend empathy and altruism towards all human beings. And if you have that impulse, maybe you feel a sense of mission in your life to contribute to the whole human race, to help others, or to bring your creativity or your altruism or your spirituality into the world for the benefit of all humans, irrespective of their nationality or their ethnic or religious status. Or maybe your circle of concern extends even further, not just to human beings, but to all living beings, to animals, to other species. Maybe you feel a sense of empathy and altruism towards other living beings. Or even more widely, to the whole of nature, to the whole of the planet Earth. Maybe you feel an impulse to protect or sustain the environment for the well-being of our entire planet, with a sense of kinship towards all natural things, towards all of the natural world. And if you feel that sense of kinship, it will manifest itself in a passionate, strong desire to protect the environment, to sustain the Earth's living systems. Or maybe most widely of all, your circle of concern stretches beyond yourself, beyond your family, beyond your community, beyond your nation, beyond the human species, beyond nature, to the whole of the Earth, or the whole of the universe, to everything which exists within this reality. Maybe you feel, as a result of that, that your life is a manifestation of some deep impulse which is coming through you rather than from you. So you feel that you're being carried by some fundamental or universal impulse which is flowing through you, and you allow your life to become the manifestation or expression of that. So that's what I mean by the circle of concern. You can see in the description I've given, you can see how the circle of concern extends more and more widely from the personal, beyond the communal, beyond the natural, towards the spiritual or the universal. And that's another way of looking at spiritual development. Spiritual development is a process of extending our circle of concern beyond ourselves more and more widely, until our concern encompasses the whole of the natural world and the whole of even the whole of the universe. But now I'd like to focus on more specific examples of concern or altruism. I'd like to focus on specific examples of altruism in our lives. I've suggested that empathy is the source of altruism. Our ability to empathize with other beings gives rise to an impulse to alleviate their suffering, or to encourage their development. So altruism is the result of connection. It emerges from connection. I'd like you to give me, if you can think of any, I want you to consider an act of altruism which you have performed in the last few days. Or it could be any time really, but I want you to think of an example of altruism in your life, an example where you were altruistic towards another person, when you helped another person in some way, or it could be an animal that you helped in some way. Or you could think of a case where another person was altruistic towards you, when somebody showed you an act of kindness. But if you can, think of something that's happened really recently. I performed an act of altruism. I'll give you my example first, then maybe you can give me your examples. You can write in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and just briefly describe it to us. But consider an act of altruism you recently received or performed. So my example is from about an hour before this session began. We've got some old bicycles in my shed because my kids are growing up now. And we had 2 bikes, which are too small for my kids now. And also an old bicycle of my wife's, which she no longer uses because she bought a new one recently. So we found out about a charity in Manchester, where I live, which collects old bikes and repairs them and donates them to refugees. So it's a refugee charity which is based on that principle. So I collected those bikes, 3 bikes, loaded them into the back of our car and drove them to this charity in Manchester and donated them to refugees. So that's my most recent act of altruism. Can anybody give me any other examples?
Well, I can probably provide one which works both ways, and it's in some ways it's a slightly silly and slightly absurd example, but it might just show the point. The other day, I buy plants from a little charity place around the corner from my house, and they had this cactus for sale. This cactus is about 18 inches tall with 2-inch spikes on it, and eventually we managed to load it up and put it in a box, and I brought it home. The box was sitting there, and then some people from Australia came down my road, which is right next to the 5 Rise Locks in Bingley. It's a bit of a beauty spot, and they wanted to find somewhere to park, and they couldn't because there are all sorts of difficulties. So I advised them on the best thing to do and said, just park up behind my car, which they did, and went to have a look at the locks. When they came back, they found me struggling with this cactus amongst numerous pillows and towels and cushions. And this rather burly Australian man came and said, "Give it to me, mate." And he managed to do it and put it in my windowsill. So within a period of 15 minutes, I was helpful to someone, and someone was even more helpful to me. I don't know whether that's a good example or not, but it struck me as being quite interesting.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent example. Thank you. Thanks for that. Lady C has said, I allowed my carer to hug me when I was upset. Thank you for that. Any other examples from anybody?
Thanks for your share and the enlightened talk, and for the person responsible for Zoom and everyone here. An example was on the 27th of June, I witnessed a baby bird being taken to actually be eaten, and we took him home to feed him, hopefully to recuperate at home. And that has come around because of a 12-step program of altruism that I'm a member of, that dramatically changed my life for the better.
Great.
I actually think I've heard you before, Steve, in a wonderful meeting I go to on Zoom.
All right.
And yes, it is real. And yes, people can change.
Brilliant. Who is that? I wasn't sure who's speaking. Is that Joanne?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. So did you say that was a 12-step altruism program?
I'm in a 12-step program that is based only on altruism.
Oh, brilliant. Right. Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that. I've never heard about that before.
Well, it's
Great.
it helps people with problems based around, I'm in one that's based around alcohol.
Right. Yeah. Sounds fantastic. Anybody else? Maybe one more example of an act of altruism that you've recently enacted or received? Okay, well, no worries. I'm sure you've actually, you have recently experienced or performed altruism, because I think it, often acts of altruism are so kind of natural to us that we don't actually become conscious of them. Our daily lives are filled with altruistic activities. But the reason I'm so interested in altruism is because it is an expression of connection. It emerges from a fundamental interconnection of human beings. And a lot of philosophers and scientists are very skeptical about altruism. If you speak to many eminent philosophers or scientists, they will say that altruism is a kind of hidden, it stems from a kind of hidden selfishness. Because if you believe that human beings are essentially separate, as most people do in our culture, most philosophers and scientists do believe in this kind of essential separateness, then it doesn't really make sense for us to be altruistic to others. Because, why would you benefit another person at risk of hindering your own well-being? Why would you potentially sacrifice your own well-being or your own resources or even your own life for the good of others? That makes no sense from a kind of survival perspective. It makes no sense from a kind of neo-Darwinist perspective. So a lot of philosophers or scientists suggest that altruism is, as I say, a kind of hidden selfishness, or it's a desire to feel better about yourself, to impress other people, to improve your reproductive possibilities, in case anybody's watching. Yeah. That's a funny one, improving your reproductive possibilities. But, according to that neo-Darwinist perspective, everything's about reproduction. It's about enhancing your attractiveness, or, enhancing your survival so that you can have more chance of replicating your genes, because that's what life's all about. Or sometimes people say that it's altruism is a kind of like an old instinct left over from when we lived in small tribes, and if people were in need, it was because it was people who were genetically related to us closely. So that's another theory. But I don't think those theories are necessary. I don't think we need to explain altruism away, because altruism emerges, as I say, from a fundamental connection. You can explain altruism in terms of the fact that all human beings stem from the same spiritual source, and it's the same spiritual essence which fills us all. We're like channels of the same source, and as a result, we can feel other people's sufferings and their joys, and we impulsively respond to them because, through that ability to share them. And let me briefly share another slide. So this is a philosophy that I call pan-spiritism, which I mentioned earlier. So I believe that all human beings, all living beings, are interconnected through a fundamental consciousness, and that is the essence of our being, this shared consciousness. And because we share the same consciousness, that gives us the ability to empathize with other people, to sense other people's pain and suffering. And that, as I've said, that impulsively, instinctively generates an impulse to alleviate other people's suffering. And that's why, let me briefly show you another slide. That's why acts of altruism are so spontaneous and so instinctive. I did some research recently into terrorist attacks, which obviously is quite a depressing topic, involving lots of brutality and destruction. But there is an incredibly positive side to it too, because every terrorist attack which I've investigated also involves hundreds or thousands of acts of selflessness and bravery. In every terrorist attack, there are lots of heroic actions from members of the public who confront the terrorist, who help others, who try to alleviate people's pain and suffering. And I was looking into the Manchester terror attack, which is, you know, the city I live in, from 6 years ago, which was when you may remember, 23 people died when a terrorist was wearing a suicide belt after a concert by Ariana Grande near Manchester Victoria train station. But the report into the attack, it found that there were hundreds or thousands of acts of bravery and selflessness by members of the public. There were so many. This was partly because the emergency services were very slow to gain access to the scene and to treat people. But in the absence of the emergency services, hundreds of people were tending each other's injuries and helping carry one another to safety. And this is an interesting comment from a paramedic who was at the scene. He said that what will stick in his mind is not the terror and destruction of the scene, but what he called the benevolence and generosity and compassion that was on display. He said there was an unbelievable amount of people doing what they could to help. I saw people pulling together, that should say, in a way I've never seen before. The thing I remember more than any other is the humanity that was on display. And as I say, that repeats itself in any terrorist attack, any crisis or emergency, actually. But terrorist attacks are especially clear indications of altruism because of the danger. There are many cases of terrorist attacks where passers-by confront a terrorist, even though he's apparently wearing a suicide belt. They try to disarm him or try to, protect people from him. And there are countless incidences of other situations where this kind of spontaneous altruism manifests itself. And it's interesting that this spontaneous altruism arises without deliberation. It's completely unconscious and spontaneous. And I think that shows that it arises from deep within our being, from the spiritual source of our being. Now, before I finish and before we have a few minutes for questions, I'd like to lead you through a final meditation just to illustrate what I've just described, to illustrate this fundamental interconnection between human beings, which gives rise to altruism and empathy. So let's close our eyes again for a moment. Let's settle into a meditative mode. I'd like you to bring your attention back into your inner space. Be aware again of the surface of your mind, of any thoughts or associations passing through the surface of your mind, like waves on the ocean or like a stream flowing by. But as we did earlier, allow yourself to fall beneath the surface of your mind into your deep being, down below, Here, we can sense the essence of our beings. We can sense the pure consciousness which fills our inner space. We can feel the energy of the essence of our beings, flowing not just through our minds, but also through our whole bodies, down into our legs, our lower bodies, down into our legs and feet, down into our arms and hands. We can feel the energetic essence of our beings flowing through the whole of our inner bodies. I'd like you to consider for a moment where this inner consciousness or inner energy comes from. What is the source of our own inner being or inner body? For a moment, let's bring our attention outside our bodies, into the space around us. Be aware of the space inside your room, also the space outside your room, beyond the walls of your house or flat. Be aware of all of that space around you. I'd like you to sense that the space around you is filled with consciousness. Consciousness fills the space around you. Consciousness is the source or the fundamental essence of the universe, which fills all space. And you can sense it around you, in the space around you, vibrating gently through the space around you. You can also sense that the dynamic energy of consciousness around you flows into your own being. It flows through your brain and into your inner space. Your brain is like a radio which picks up the consciousness in the space around you and receives it and channels it into your own being. Be aware of that process now, how your brain picks up the consciousness all around you and it flows through your brain into your inner being and becomes your own consciousness. Just sense that your brain is like a radio picking up the waves of consciousness outside you, allowing them to flow into you and become your inner being. You can sense that your own consciousness is one with the consciousness outside you. It's a channel of the consciousness all around you, flowing into your being. The same process occurs with all human beings and all living beings. The same fundamental universal consciousness flows into them through their brains or the cells of their bodies, becoming their inner being. Maybe you can even picture that process, how universal consciousness flows into all living beings, becoming their individual inner beings. That means that all living beings share the same consciousness. The same consciousness flows into all beings. So that we are all one, and we can sense each other's emotions and experiences. And we can respond to them with altruism. Just for a moment longer, let's sense our connection and our shared source with all beings. And let's sense that our own consciousness flows or is a channel of universal consciousness. And let me end this meditation by reading a short poem, which is called "We Are Each Other." We're not ghostly entities marooned inside our mental space with our personal pain and suffering that can never be shared or understood. We're not machines full of selfish genes who are always scheming to outdo each other and only ever show kindness if there's a benefit to ourselves. We are each other. Every human being's feelings flow like air through the atmosphere of our communal being, brushing each other's souls, touching each other's hearts, stirring mutual compassion. We feel compassion because we're connected. We sense each other's sufferings because we share each other's being. We risk our lives for others because there is only one life. We help and heal and love each other because we are each other. So let's retain that feeling of connection. And if you haven't already, open your eyes. Let's open them now and bring this meditation to a close. Let me just end by saying that I think this this spiritual movement beyond separation towards connection and union, I think it's much bigger than us as individuals. I think it's part of the evolution of life on this planet, maybe the evolution of life, you know, in the universe as a whole. But life as a whole moves towards increasing integration, increasing connection, and ultimately towards union. So I think our lives are an expression of this process, and the impulse that many of us feel to move towards oneness, or to practice spirituality, to follow spiritual paths and practices, it's a manifestation of this deep impulse which has carried life all the way from the simplest life forms on this planet towards greater complexity. And it will obviously move further into the future towards greater integration and even greater connection. Thank you.